Welcome to Ethics Matter. I'm Stephanie Tsai. As the world continues to confront the threats from Islamist terrorism, societies are grappling with what tools and responses work to address the problem. It's a hydra-headed monster of an issue that we're talking about with our guest, Karen Greenberg. Karen is a noted expert on national security, terrorism, and civil liberties, and the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham University. Her latest book, Rogue Justice: The Making of the Security State, explores what impact the so-called war on terror has had on the legal principles once held dear in America. Karen, welcome. It's good to see you.
It's nice to be here.
Even as I said the word Islamist terrorism, I caught myself and thought even that term has become so fraught. And so I want to get into that. But first, let's start by talking about ISIS and what many consider the biggest global threat today when it comes to terrorism. How has it evolved recently?
So ISIS came to the attention of the American law enforcement system well before 2014, but in 2014, you started to see individuals apprehended and charged with charges related to ISIS specifically. So for about 2.5 years now, the United States has been monitoring these cases, monitoring individuals, trying to figure out who might want to foment an attack, be a foreign fighter, a variety of things. In Europe, I think this has been at a much more accelerated pace and many more numbers of individuals who have been suspected of terrorism and who have carried out actually terrorist acts. But we're looking basically in a very condensed way at the last 2.5 years.
So Fordham University has actually looked case by case at ISIS-related convictions, from what I understand. How many of those have there been in this country?
There have been just over 100 cases. Over half of them have been resolved, and less than those have been sentenced.
So when you look at those individuals, what trends come out?
A number of very interesting trends. And again, this distinguishes us in some ways from the rest of the world. The first is their age. We also keep a database of Al-Qaeda prosecutions. Al-Qaeda prosecutions, the ages were the average of late 20s, early 30s. The ISIS case individuals, the most frequent age of those arrested and indicted for ISIS-related crimes is 20. That means that they come on the radar of law enforcement or begin to get involved in their late teens. So this is a phenomenon here of late adolescence. And what we're seeing more and more is individuals who are looking for some kind of messianic purpose in life, who feel, and that's why they want to join the caliphate abroad, for those who wanted to be foreign fighters, individuals who are alienated in one way or another, some who spend an awful lot of time reading social media and relating to the world in that way, individuals who are looking for some kind of identity, many of whom don't have a vision of what their future could be in this country, and who are attracted to the notion of violence. And so what we've seen in the second year of ISIS in this country is, instead of looking to go abroad, much of which was tamped down by federal law enforcement interfering with anybody who wanted to go abroad to Turkey,
fight in Syria or Iraq.
Right, to go to Turkey as a window to Syria, really, as a gateway to Syria, are people who have focused their attention on talking about attacks in this country or in taking measures to have attacks in this country. And that's sort of a change in what we've seen. And again, these individuals are a cross between a lost soul and somebody who's attracted to violence. A number of these individuals have tried to join the army or have tried to join a militia. They have tried to get some kind of weapons training. Some have talked about joining the military to get training to conduct acts of terrorism. It's a handful, but still it's a very interesting trend, and so it's a combination of these things.
Just to unpack that a little bit, and going back to that phrase I used to describe the phenomenon, just because I think journalists we need some language to describe what we're talking about, and Islamist terrorism is the phrase that I used, but it begs the question how much religion really does play in to that first factor you talked about, and ISIL-specific ideology, which is building a caliphate, getting land. And how much does that really play in to what?
Right. So the experts are very torn on this. There are some experts who will say this is religion, let's not hide from that. And there are others who say this isn't religion, stop being biased against religion. I think it's more complicated than either one. I think a third of the cases in the United States involve individuals who are not Muslim born but were attracted to the idea of ISIS and converted to Islam, or who converted and then found their way to ISIS. It's hard to say where the cause and effect is, but these are converts. So that already tells you something. In terms of their actual indoctrination into the religion and the religious precepts, that's also hard to see. With Al-Qaeda, there was a sense of religious ideology and philosophy that was deep-rooted and often, came up in some very almost Talmudic, ways, hadith ways. And so I think that to mix metaphors, but I think that these individuals are attracted to a more superficial sense of religion, and religion as a oppositional stance that they're taking. And ISIS is the cult. And I see ISIS very much as a cult that attracts them with a way to express their sense of dissatisfaction, alienation, and intense anger. And so I don't think it's really all about religion. I think this is very much about ISIS's reaching out to individuals who are dissatisfied for a number of reasons that are often very personal.
And that social media component, a number of the attackers in this country and elsewhere have been inspired by Anwar al-Awlaki. So talk a little bit about his continuing influence, especially on Americans that would be terrorists.
Sure. Anwar al-Awlaki has always been an important part of the narrative of first Al-Qaeda and then ISIS. In many ways, he's the link between Al-Qaeda and ISIS in terms of a narrative. He is a propagandist who was in the United States, went abroad, and then began to reach out to Americans and to explain to them what terrorism was about and why it would be important to join. But his influence since his death, when there was a targeted killing successfully against American citizen Anwar al-Awlaki.
A controversial one.
A very controversial one. But since his death, he has not diminished in importance. If you look at the figures that are named, al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS, bin Laden, the head of, now killed, of Al-Qaeda, and Anwar al-Awlaki, you'll see that al-Awlaki is almost on a par with al-Baghdadi, that he is the individual, partly because of his Americanism, who knows what, who's able to reach out and who understood the power of social media very early on and began to exploit it then. And so he stayed alive in a very important way through social media, through his sermons. One of the things that a number of these individuals have done is to download al-Awlaki sermons and to download references to al-Awlaki. So he's iconically an important figure and definitely a spiritual link in a way between Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
When you were talking about an open society like ours with easy access to the internet, to downloading al-Awlaki videos, bomb-making videos, and all of that, how do you address that? I mean, do you start with everybody that downloads an al-Awlaki video, and even if there was a way to figure out who those people are, do you start with that from a law enforcement perspective?
Much of what's done on the internet is public. So if it's, Facebook or something where you can actually be law enforcement and look into something, that's one way. But this is an extremely controversial part of how we, as a society, decide to identify an individual to follow. And probably to say the cause and effect of looking at these things and becoming a terrorist is not a good cause and effect, causal relation. And largely because what we've learned over time in encountering terrorism is that more is not better. That more, in fact, can be a deterrent, a distraction. What you really want is to be able to focus on the individuals who seem like they could take an act of violence, like San Bernardino, like Garland. And so just because they're watching al-Awlaki, it doesn't mean enough. And so would you want to start there? I'm not sure.
It sounds actually like what you're suggesting is we should look at criminal behavior and criminal history almost before we look at radicalization. Because you can be radicalized and still not decide to be violent, right?
Correct.
You can have radical thoughts and not decide to commit an act of terror.
You can be very angry, and talk about it all the time, and spout out about it all the time, and not commit an act of terror or not even want to. I think you're right. I think there has to be a much better sense of, look, these are young, when I said they're young, 18 to 20 to 21, they don't have criminal records. A number of them have had encounters with the police who have said, listen, don't go down this road, sort of an interventionist, with law enforcement. But they're not going to have the same criminal record as, for example, in France, where the individuals they were older. The ISIS in Europe is largely built on a criminal element. Sometimes we're often radicalized in prison. That's not the case here. This is a different story. And so, no, I would not looking at criminal behavior, but looking at overt acts, like getting guns and at the same time that you're talking about wanting to kill people or anything like that. The overt act of actually getting the materials for a crime, an attack, whether it's an explosive, a combination of explosives, a pressure cooker.
That seems obvious to me. As a layperson, that seems like that's obviously what you should do. If somebody buys a pressure cooker and a bunch of ingredients for bomb making, and then also some guns, that should flag somebody. Yeah. And yet we've seen time after time again that they haven't been flagged before the fact.
Right. Although we haven't had that many attacks in the United States. Largely we've seen a number of these lone wolf types of attacks over the past year. Since 9/11, less than 100 individuals have been killed for terrorism in the United States. Now, every single one of those deaths is a tragedy, and we would like to prevent all of them. But in the fall of 2016, you had a bomber in New Jersey and New York, and no one was killed. Right. Not even the bomber himself, which is the first time we haven't had an individual who carried out an attack in the name of ISIS who wasn't killed. And so I think that you have to sort of put this in perspective in terms of this larger wave of violence that's clearly going on in the United States. 3,000 deaths in Chicago in the past year by gun violence. This is a major phenomenon that we have to think about in much more creative ways than we've thought about it in the past.
That's a great point, is to put it in the context. But since the topic is terrorism and U.S. responses to it, some might say the fact that the U.S. has had fewer attacks than France, for example, may show that it's doing something right. And I know a lot of your research has been around how the U.S. law, how legal principles have been altered, and that post 9/11, we did a lot of things that undermined some of the basic legal principles that this country was founded on. How would you grade how U.S. justice and law enforcement is doing today in combating ISIS and ISIS supporters and would-be terrorists?
I think we've done a number of things right. I think the move in the Bush administration continued in the Obama administration to have an interagency process that vets information, that coordinates information, which did not exist to that extent, nowhere near to that extent prior to 9/11, has been a major step forward.
From an intel perspective.
From an intel perspective, right. which everybody at that table is intel, it's law enforcement, it's DOD, it's the Department of Defense, it's Department of Treasury, it's the whole group, Department of Justice, that might have a perspective, that might know something. I think that our relations with foreign countries and sharing intelligence have also gotten better. Probably there's some room for improvement there. I think that the sharing of intelligence with localities is something that may grow in the future, for better or for worse, depending on how that happens. I think that narrowing the space where a terrorist attack can take place is a very important thing, and I think to some extent that's what the fall 2016 bombing showed.
But let me stop you there.
Yeah.
Because the way we have narrowed the space in which terrorist attacks have occurred is by surveillance, right? Is by sort of putting cameras everywhere. Times Square is an example of that. There are cameras everywhere. Ever since the Times Square bombing attack, which was several years ago, you can't walk a foot in Times Square and not be spotted.
That's right. But there's a difference between surveillance cameras that somebody's looking at in real time and collecting information and keeping information that is usable and searchable for however long, like what went on in a bulk warrantless surveillance way. If you decide, and you're looking at Times Square, and you decide you want to follow somebody, you need to have some kind of probable cause, that you're trying to collect information and evidence on this person. But the difference between just surveilling and collecting and using and holding and sort of doing mass searches on telephone and internet communications seems to me very different than having cameras.
But is it okay to have cameras in every corner of public space in this country?
Again, I think it's how the information is used. I really do, and I think that at some point we may want less, and it's less in this country than it is, say, in the UK. It's less in a number of cities in this country than it is sort of the major hubs. So I'm not completely comfortable with it, but I'm going to be the first to admit that the things that we would have put up with on September 10th, 2001 have changed somewhat. And in some ways, I'm sort of unhappy about this, but the surveillance camera in and of itself is not as destructive.
Which part makes you unhappy?
About?
In the post 9/11.
Here's what makes me unhappy in the post 9/11 thing. The acceptance of the idea of warrantless searches and bulk collection, which is something that the sunsetting of the Patriot Act addressed, which I think could still come back. Executive killing, again, a principle this country was founded upon not having.
And again, just to describe what that is for the audience, that would include the targeting of Anwar al-Awlaki by a U.S. airstrike.
But I'm not even talking about just American citizens. I think the policy is something that we've all come to accept, but that has certain downsides. The vesting of so much power in the presidency. If we have a president we like, that's one thing. If we have a president who is not accountable to the Constitution or to a constituency, then we have a problem. And it's a serious problem. And we have just come through 15 years where the courts, for the most part, the Supreme Court aside in some instances, notably detention, where the courts, for the most part, have deferred to the executive in cases of national security, and a Congress that has deferred to the executive in cases of national security. And so, for a number of reasons, our presidency is stronger than perhaps in any time before in the name of national security. And this is something that is potentially dangerous going forward.
You write in your book, quote, "It is the quiet decisions, the individual judicial rulings and laws and executive orders generally fashioned by well-meaning people that make possible the fiascos, the follies, and the excess that turn governments into the enemies of their constituents." That is a lot of what you just talked about, and you gave some examples. Are we out of that now? Is the pendulum swinging back the other way?
I would say that the pendulum has swung back only very slightly. Torture has been declared illegal, but apparently it's okay to talk about it and reviving it in public discourse. I think the surveillance policies, as I mentioned before, from the Patriot Act, the NSA bulk metadata collection process, bulk collection, has sunsetted. So there has been some swing back, but let me add, it hasn't been because of civil liberties, in my opinion. I think what you learn is that it's been because congressional committee and presidential commissions have determined that it didn't work. And so it was the combination of civil liberties. Same thing as
that it didn't actually make us safer.
It didn't make us safer. It didn't identify terrorists of note. It didn't stop an attack. All of these metrics. And so civil libertarians kept the flame alive and reminded us of who we are. But the actual reason these things sunsetted was that they didn't work. And so that's what we have to deal with in the next chapter of our war against terrorism.
What about the countries that are experiencing in greater frequency attacks by ISIS-inspired or ISIS-directed terrorists, places like France, like Brussels, like the UK? How are they responding?
Very interestingly, after 2014, after ISIS really came into global prominence and declared the caliphate in the middle of 2014, and the attacks in France and elsewhere, there were a number of pieces of legislation passed that really upped the surveillance possibilities, the search possibilities, etc., in these countries. And so in a way, they became, less lawful than they had been in the past in terms of the restraints of government. At the same time, a number of these countries have developed very aggressive de-radicalization programs. And they range from those that are, say for in the UK, where they have a program where they're tasking civil servants and teachers and others to identify individuals who show some kind of trajectory that might lead to radicalization, and they are being held accountable for it. And to me, this seems like a far cry from what might actually work to create a safe democratic society.
It also sounds like thought police. It sounds an awful lot like making somebody guilty for a thought that they have.
It reads like that. It feels like that. And let's also remember that individuals with different ideas, whatever they are, don't we want that? Don't we want individuals who can see things with new eyes? I don't mean people who want to blow us up. This is not what I'm talking about. But there's a worry, not just about the thought police, but what kind of individuals are we going to create in that kind of world? And how much have we sort of submitted to fear? And so it's a problem. But let me say that, interestingly enough, France, which has suffered numerous attacks at the hands of ISIS and has upped its police powers by new acts in 2014, 2015, has done some very interesting work, as has Germany, in thinking about prevention and de-radicalization that involve integration, that talk about integration. We'll see how, what the reality there is, but that understand that this is a problem. You cannot have people living in your midst, whether they're Muslims or others, and not think that their children, that they and their children can have a viable future there. You want people in your country to want to vote. You want people to think that they can be civically engaged and that they can have a voice. And so this is the hurdle that Europe has to cross, and it's the hurdle that America has to be very mindful of, that we want to make sure that civic engagement is part of how we think about preventing the growth of violence.
That alienation is something that brings us back to one of the trends that you found when you were researching these ISIS prosecutions in this country. You wonder, when you talk especially about those that have been radicalized and joined the ISIS cause outside of the US, a lot of times that's been described as those countries in Europe being less concerned about integration. And so even second or third generation Muslim who had parents that were immigrants but were native born to those countries, they don't feel like part of society. Do they also sort of lack a national identity? And is that going to be a problem in this country?
The lack of a national identity is actually something that is laced through the database, both for Al-Qaeda prosecutions and for ISIS cases in the United States. And it's one of the underplayed and not sufficiently understood phenomena, this seeming lack of there are a number of individuals who were born in one country, went to another country, say the UK, then came and settled here, who feel very displaced, not just by us, by their life. Now we're in a situation where we have refugees in the tens of thousands and more pouring out of the Middle East, and a world that has not decided what to do with this, but some sense of, well, we'll keep them here until they can go back or whatever it is. This is a prescription for chaos and trouble, because if national identity is really important to a sense of who you are, where you belong, where you can have a future, who you can trust to protect you, then having refugees who don't have that kind of identification is potentially problematic. And let's remember that displaced persons, refugee camps, refugee enclaves in the late 20th century gave birth to much of the frustrations that were part of the Al-Qaeda narrative and the bin Laden narrative. And so we know that we need to figure out a way to make sure that refugees feel safe and taken care of. And the other side of that is, you take care of somebody who is lost and homeless in a national sense and doesn't know their future, and you actually give them a home, they're gonna be loyal to you.
Right.
So you need to keep that in mind.
It sounds like it's not just the humane thing to do, it's actually a national security, global stability issue.
And that's what we found over and over in looking at what civil libertarians ask for and what works and what doesn't work in a very odd way for reasons that work on some level that's not apparent. These things reinforce one another, and that's the case throughout. And for example, just one thing I just want to add here is you'd be surprised at how many of the cases, some Al-Qaeda cases and a number of the ISIS cases, mention drone strikes, mention knowing individuals who were killed by targeted killings by the United States. Now, that may or may not have been the tipping point, but it's there in the narrative. And if we're going to continue to do it as a policy, we need to really think about this in the larger scheme of things of what security and liberty is about.
Right, and the question of whether that leads to sort of a vicious cycle of revenge and then attacks, and it goes on and on and on.
Well, this is what we want to not have. We don't want a vicious cycle. We want to step back, not feel so fearful that we can't be compassionate.
Yeah.
Have you met a person that's been given kindness and consideration, that actually has decided to join a bloodthirsty cult?
Right.
No, those are damaged individuals, and what we want to do is create environments where there are fewer and fewer damaged individuals, and that is as important as any other trajectory we're going to go on.
Oh, that's actually a very fresh perspective. Karen Greenberg, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.